All right, guys. So this is 4.7. Okay, it's CPCTC. CPCTC, you guys have the note sheet. All right. It stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So go ahead, fill that in. All right, guys. And we're going to use this when you're asked to prove sides, all right, or angles are congruent. Okay. When you're asked to prove sides or angles are congruent. So when I say parts just means sides or angles, okay? So that is what, when we say corresponding parts, that's the sides or angles. So but first, to do this is we have to prove that the triangles are congruent, all right? So that's the first thing that you have to do. You have to prove that the triangles are congruent, and then the next step will be that the sides or angles are congruent by CPCTC. Okay, so just so you know what I mean, we'll do the first proof together. So guys, proofs are going to get a little bit more complicated because you guys already have a good foundation of it. Okay, so you're going to see a lot of just blank proofs that you're going to be filling in. Okay, and we're also going to be using delta math as well. All right, so what you want to look at is you want to look at the given statements and the proof statements. Okay, so for this, the proof, all right, that still goes in the last box. Okay, and since it's an angle, it's a part. All right, so we fill that in. Angle BCA is congruent to angle DCA. Okay, so you fill that in. Okay, we know the reason for that. I mean, we can jump the gun here a little bit. Is going to be CPCTC. Okay, now the step before that is we're going to have to prove the triangles are congruent. So let's start writing our statement. So we got AB is congruent to AD. All right, and we have BC is congruent to DC. So that should be a D right there. Didn't look like it. So those are both given and given, okay? So then next, we mark up our picture, okay? Mark it up so that we figure out how these triangles are going to be congruent. So AB to AD, BC to CD or DC. So, and then we also know that since these are butted up next to each other, that they share AC, so that side is going to be congruent. So the triangles are congruent by side, side, side. And the only piece that we kind of filled in on our own was that AC is congruent to AC. What's the reason for that? The reflexive property, okay? And guys, get your note sheet out that we used before for proofs, because that has all the reasons why sides and angles are congruent. So that's what you're going to want to use when you're filling in this stuff. So, and then the next step, since we got everything, we got the three sides, we know that the triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So we just have to write the congruent statement. Make sure you match up the vertices. I'm going to go A to B to C. All right, so triangle ABC is congruent to triangle. And if I went A to B, there's one mark there. So I have to go from A to D, okay? So triangle A, D, and then I can go to C. And then the last step is going to be CPCTC. Those two angles are congruent, all right? So guys, the goal of this, after you've kind of seen this proof, is that once we know that the triangles are congruent by this shortcut, we're going back in reverse and saying, all right, so now I know this BCA and DCA right here, which BCA is this angle right here and DCA is that angle right there. I know those two angles are going to be congruent because those two angles are going to be congruent because the triangles are congruent. So we kind of started out in 4.1 and had that everything was congruent, all sides and angles. Then we find these shortcuts, and technically in a proof, like I've told you, we only know what they tell us. Okay, we do not know anything else. There's certain things we can assume, and that's on your proof sheet, but everything else we don't know yet. So we have to write it down in the proof and give a reason for it. So that's what we're doing here, is we're saying, okay, we know the triangles are congruent, so we know these parts are congruent. All right, like part of it is like, well, duh, but at the same time, we have to write it down, because if we don't write it down, we don't know it's true. All right, so if we go on to the next one, all right, so for this one, we are saying, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can get all of in there, that PS is parallel to QR. Remember, guys, we don't know that those sides are congruent. If you have parallel lines, you have congruent angles. Next, it says angle QPS right here is congruent to angle SRQ right here. So we have that those two angles are congruent. And then we also have QS. They're butted up next to each other, so we know that QS is going to be congruent to QS. All right. And so the next thing we need to know, is from the parallel lines. Okay. So we got to figure out what angles are going to be congruent. So if we have our parallel lines, all right, and they're going to be cut by this transversal right here, which is going to be QS. What we can say, and this is where we have to look at the picture and figure out, well, what is going to help us? What information is going to help us to figure out that, the angles, that we can get a congruence theorem, I guess. What's going to help us so that we can get a congruence theorem? So if we say that this angle is congruent to this angle, then we know that if we kind of trace along the side here, that if we start here, we go from an angle to a side. So the congruence theorem is going to be angle, angle, side. All right. So now we can start filling in the proof. Okay. So I'm going to fill in the given statements here. All right, guys. So I have the given statements filled in, and then the next thing is that QS is congruent to QS. All right, because that is the reflexive property. All right, and then the next thing is that we have those two angles were congruent. All right, because those are alternate interior angles. And if you haven't noticed that if we have two triangles that butt up next to each other and form a quadrilateral or something with four sides, okay, because we have a shape with four sides here, it's always going to be alternate interior angles, okay? They butt up next to each other, it has to be alternate interior. So we know that angle PQS, notice that I put the vertex there in the middle, is congruent to angle RSQ because, and I'm going to abbreviate here, alternate interior angles, okay? Now, the next step is that we know the triangles are congruent. We talked about it being angle, angle, side. So we're going to say that triangle and make sure we match up the vertices. I'm going to do P to Q to S, okay? P, Q, S. So if I do that, then I have to go P has one mark, R has one mark. So it's going to be triangle R. And then I went to Q next. S has two marks, Q has two marks. So it's going to be RSQ. That's the reason. And then the last thing is we can put in that PQ. PQ is congruent to RS because of CPCTC. Okay, so that is that one. So guys, I'm gonna do one more with you. So let's do number 5. I think this one's tricky. So for this one, I'm going to fill in the given statements and mark up the picture as well. All right, guys, so I put the given statements in. I marked the picture up, okay, because we have that D is the midpoint of BF, so I know that BD is congruent to DF. I also know with the parallel lines, they're cut by the transversal EC, okay? And I'm going to know that angle E is congruent to angle C. You could have also said that angle B is congruent to angle F. Either one is fine, okay? So either one would have worked for this proof. That's why I wanted to clarify that, okay? So if you said that B is congruent to F by alternate interior angles, you're fine too. I'm going to use E and C, okay? So the next thing that we have to do is we're going to fill out that, let's do angle E is congruent to angle C. What's the reason for that? alternate interior angles. All right. Now, I kind of jumped the gun here, and we haven't figured out why the triangles are going to be congruent. So this one, hopefully you guys see it. All right. Hopefully you guys are seeing how proofs work. Like in a quadrilateral, when we have two triangles, we know that the reflexive property is going to be used. When we have these two triangles that are opposite each other and we have the kiss and fish, we are going to have vertical angles here. Okay. I think we're pretty good with the vertical angles. So we have the vertical angles. So now, again, if I trace the triangle, if I start at E, I go from an angle to a side. So angle, angle, side is the reason why these two triangles are congruent. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put that angle BDC is congruent to angle FDE. And that is going to be because of vertical angles. And then we're also going to have that BD is congruent to FD. Okay, and that is because definition of the midpoint. All right. So we have a midpoint. We're always going to use definition of midpoint. Guys, these steps right here, okay, I can put them in any order that I want to. Okay, it does not matter what order you have them in. Okay, so if I put the angle E is congruent to angle C and I put that in step 5, not wrong. I just need to have 3 congruent parts to use my congruence theorem, or 2 congruent parts to prove that hypotenuse leg is congruent. Okay, that's all you have to have. You can put those in any order that you want. All right, any order. So now, guys, we know that the triangle is congruent by angle, angle, side. So what we're going to do is we're going to say triangle, and let's start out with E. E to D to F is congruent to, and E has 1 mark, so we're going to start out with triangle C, and then we're going to go to D because D has 2 marks there, so C to D to B. Okay, it's angle, angle, side. Last thing is that ED is congruent to CD by CPCTC. Guys, that is it for number 5. I have not done 3 and 4 for you. However, the answers are in Canvas. Look in the 4.7 notes key. So I'd like you guys to try those before you come into class next week. All right. And during class next week, basically, we're just going to be working through problems, getting way more practice with proofs. You guys can ask me questions, but that's going to be the goal for next week. So make sure you watch this video. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving.